Welcome to the Salience Podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
Today on the Salience Podcast, we return to cross-domain mapping, exploring how tactical leadership and decision-making taught in the military can be applied to start-up and scale-up challenges for business and as a way to accelerate change in frontline agencies. One of the biggest challenges for military-trained leaders is adapting to the radically different power structure of civilian organisations. For starters, command and control just doesn't work the same way. I often see veterans appointed to civilian leadership roles, and the civies just don't respond at all well to being told. I've seen the opposite, where veterans really do lead adaptively, using a range of leadership approaches that suit the situation. So today, I want to tease apart the difference that makes a difference in effective leadership and decision-making through that military lens. Today's guest is Ben Ford from Mission Control. Ben is a former Royal Marine and uses what he learned in the Defence Force to help veteran entrepreneurs develop a competitive advantage in business. I first came across Ben through LinkedIn, where I noticed his posts about OODA, John Boyd's Observe, Orient, Decide, Act decision-making framework, and how to apply that process in tech. Welcome, Ben.
Great to be here. I've been really looking forward to this. It's taking us a little while to get it in the books, but great to be here.
Yeah, no, thanks for jumping on. So I do want to go into the Royal Marines and OODA, but I like to sort of get an exploration of some of the things that happened before people landed there, and I'd really like you to think a little bit about your own journey before you enlisted. What kind of early experiences led you to the Royal Marines? You know, people don't just stumble in there generally. What sort of thought, what sort of process led you there?
Well, I think probably a couple of things. So I, like many people of my generation, I guess, I was bullied quite a lot at school, and I decided at some point it just sort of, all of that triggered into, want to be able to look after myself, want to test myself. And, the Marines became, all right, I'm going to join the Marines one day. It was probably around when I was like 14 or 15. But I wasn't particularly fit. And I went through, I've got a book up on my shelf, still up there actually, by a guy, I think it's Robin Egger. He wrote a book about, becoming commando fit. So I followed this program. And then I, went off and did various different things, went to uni, ended up working on the doors of some really shitty clubs in Portsmouth, and finally joined up when I was 23. So I took quite a circuitous route, but I guess it was always going to be the destination. Like in my mind, I was always going to join up.
Yeah, right. It's interesting that kind of bullying, moving from I'm not going to be a victim here anymore, I'm going to get commando fit. And then there would have been a fair bit of journey between bullied as a 14-year-old and working the doors of Portsmouth.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things you did there? Obviously, you got commando fit. What else?
Well, again, I've never really planned anything, I guess. I went to university, so I did maths and physics at A-level. I've always been very curious about how things worked. Went and did started an engineering degree, and I guess the environment didn't really agree with me. It was very academic. It wasn't very practical, and I was fairly lazy, to be honest. So I dropped out from there, ended up in Portsmouth, and I was working on behind the bar originally. And then I'd always been doing sort of martial arts, and when I went and did some training with some of the doormen, they were like, "Well, you're kind of wasted behind the bar. You should come work on the door." And working on the door with a team of other doormen is quite a fun experience when you're in your early 20s. So yeah, I'm glad I kind of fell into that, but it certainly wasn't planned or anything.
Yeah, right. It's an interesting interview process, hey, where you've been, you're forming these relations. People know you've got a capability. I just want to imagine for a moment that you're at an interview for a job in a tech startup now. So you're going from the military and tech, and I'm going to go back and forth between these two. Somebody on the panel asks you, so Ben, what did you learn in the Royal Marines that will be useful to us? How would you answer?
Oh, that's a great question, because I didn't have an answer for that for the first 10 years after I got out of the Marines. It certainly did occur a few times where, being a Royal Marine on a software engineer's CV is unusual and therefore kind of bumped me up the pile. It definitely got me at least an interview that I shouldn't have had once, at least. But I didn't really have an answer for it. I spent the first 10 years when I was just purely software developer and DevOps engineer, not really being into the kind of agile world or leadership or anything like that, thinking that the two didn't really have that much of a link. I thought, my time in the Marines was a kind of fun few years in my mid-20s. And, now I'm a grown up software developer working in London with kids, it's like then and now. And so it wasn't until I started getting into, funny enough, Boyd and OODA. So I ran probably about 10 years ago, I started to take on some leadership roles, and I started to read into, Kanban and Agile and, all these kind of different dogmas or religions or whatever you want to call them, which is how they often show up. And I started to see some commonalities between my role in the Marines. I was a signaller, so I was basically responsible for shuffling information around. And I started to see some similarities in the structures of, mission command and how information and intent was passed around an organization. And around about that time, I guess, Team of Teams came out, Jocko Willink's book, Extreme Ownership, came out, Turn the Ship Around came out. And these books, I read all of them about the time I was sort of starting to think about all this stuff. And then I came across John Boyd. Again, I'd never heard of him in the military at all. Never heard of these ideas in the military at all. And that was the kind of the light bulb. So now if somebody asked me that, I would say that I'd had exposure to a very high performing way of managing chaos that is unusual in the software industry, and that I've spent enough time understanding the principles behind what we did in the military work that I wouldn't make the mistake that you alluded to earlier, that you can just blindly apply this stuff, right? The principles are universal, the principles apply anywhere, but the practices are emergent based on many, many, many different factors, not least of which the military has this rather unrealistic onboarding process that we call basic training, which in my case lasted 30 weeks and is much more of a cultural indoctrination than it's not just teaching how to shoot guns and stuff. That's completely absent in the civilian world. So if your entire leadership structure is built upon that as a premise that everyone has that kind of foundation, well, immediately that's absent in Civvy Street. So you need to change your approach. And sorry, that was a very, very long-winded answer to quite a simple question.
No, I think it provides some really important context. I'm going to come back to signals and signaling later, particularly around the observe orient part of the OODA loop. And,
yes, definitely.
And I've got something. This is a personal bias. I've seen lots of people trying to improve OODA. And everything that I've seen that's been an improvement on OODA actually has not been an improvement on OODA. If you take it in its entirety and applied in complex systems, it is just a sensational way of thinking and orienting and using. Even if it's just an aide de memoire that you look at and you go, what am I doing right now? Where am I right now? And am I stuck here? There's this beautiful piece, and I can't remember who said it. I wrote it in Resilience by Design. And it's somebody describes ooh, 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 the sound of dithering and getting caught in the OODA loop. And I quite like that. It's like, where am I? Am I making decisions at the right tempo? Am I getting on with it? And so there's this observe, orient, decide, act, and there are some feed forward and feedback loops in there that are absolutely crucial. And it's very much a non-linear, start anywhere, evaluate, work out what you're doing. But what I want to do is I want to go back to particularly focus on observe and orient, which I think is the absolute gold of OODA, in my opinion. And I want to unpack a little bit more about how you use it deliberately for startups and scale-ups? What is it that you teach? What is it that you apply? Tell us about the daily practice of using OODA.
Yeah, well, that's another kind of potentially quite long-winded answer, because my inability to effectively use OODA is probably what led me to my current business, Mission Control. So, I spent a long time, reading up on this stuff, making the links, understanding that, business agility and agile software in particular is all kind of derived from, largely from Boyd's work, but, more generally from the ideas of kind of Alfred's tactic and mission command, distributed decision making. And so I thought, well, surely all I need to do is just, show some people this stuff and it'll be good, right? And I did, a few consults, built a little course, taught some people this stuff. And the problem is that, like in many walks of life, there's a Pareto distribution of people that are going to be interested in this stuff. And you have to be really, really interested in OODA to really break through this, what I call like the local maxima of the simple version of OODA, right? The simple version of OODA is first you observe, then you orient, then you decide, then you act, and then you do the loop again. And the quicker you do it, the quicker you win, right? It's not wrong, but it's very simplistic, and it's very easy for people to look at that and say, yeah, great, I've looked at OODA for half an hour, now I get it. But as you said, right, there's a lot of nuance to it. There's a huge, huge amount of depth. OODA is not Boyd as a 1950s fighter pilot coming up with this. OODA is Boyd as a man at the end of his career and life who had been studying, thermodynamics, Eastern philosophy, organizational science, physics. It's the entirety of his life's work collapsed into this little diagram. And so I became quite dissatisfied with that, because, you go into these organizations where leaders ought to care about this stuff and ought to, want to know about this stuff, but they really just don't have the bandwidth. And, back to your comment earlier about signaling, I realized that one of the reasons that they don't have the bandwidth is because they are just being assailed from all directions by information that's not been properly structured and rooted. And so I set Mission Control up in order, rather than trying to teach better practice top down, so leadership down to kind of middle management, however you would describe that, I decided to try and attack the problem bottom up, which is, at the edges of an organization where you interface with the environment, there's a whole load of stuff that people are doing that machines can be doing, which is automation and, in today's world, obviously AI and automation. And my reasoning was that if I can remove the overwhelm first, perhaps I can give people back the bandwidth required to treat this with the kind of depth that it really deserves. And when I teach or talk about OODA now, maybe I'm a little bit hubristic here, but I do think there is a representation problem that OODA has, and I believe that Boyd was looking towards fixing it towards the end of his life. I've seen something that Chet Richards said, I can't remember where. Chet Richards is one of his compadres, obviously, saying that, if Boyd was to kind of draw the OODA loop again, it would just be right? It would be the orientation, because orientation is everything. And when I try and explain the OODA loop, I explain, what it means, what it is, show people the Boyd diagram. And then I do a bit of a thought experiment, which is related to some of the newer thinking in neuroscience and cognition. And I say, well, what about if we start from action first? Because, there is no observation without action, because you have to act first in order to have some expectation about what your effect of your action is going to be. And that, that's how our cognition works. If you read things like, Being You by Anil Seth, or, any other kind of contemporary neuroscience, the thinking is now that it's not some kind of top-down model that interacts with the environment. It's actually built, our orientation is built by interacting with the environment. I'm sitting here now my whole visual field is being built by micro movements in my eyes, picking up differences and changes. It's not me sitting here passively absorbing information. So I try and start with action. Action then sets an expectation. I kind of draw OODA as something that is the feedback and feed forward loops actually go back into orientation, because I think that's probably more likely how it works. So I say that, you start with action. Action creates an expectation. Expectation is something within your orientation. Now you've got some idea of how the world's going to unfold based on the action that you've taken. That then intertwines with your observation, because if you expect something, you're more likely to observe it, right? You're more attuned to it, and you're more likely to miss things that don't agree with what you expect to see. So when you do finally realize that you've got something slightly wrong, or that the environment isn't unfolding exactly as you expect, then you get a surprise. And the surprise then has to create some kind of intention. And the intention is either I'm going to change my model and improve my model because I think what happened should have happened, actually, on reflection, or you roll into another action, possibly via decision if you had to sort of sit and think about it for a bit, but you take another action in order to try and bring what's happening in the outside world further into alignment with what you expected. And that, when you start from action, you get something that I believe Boyd implicitly understood from all of the work. Like, given that he passed away a quarter of a century ago, the fact that his body of work hangs with contemporary neuroscience very, very well is absolutely incredible, really. But I think when you start from action, you end up with something that's a bit closer to how entities actually interact with their environment. And I think it can help to break this kind of linear loop thinking, and it's relatively easy to explain in that way, I hope.
You have touched on a number of really important topics there. One that I like is where you said you've gone from the top down to the middle, and then thinking about the edges and removing overwhelm. And I think you're onto something really important there. In most of the frontline agencies that I work with, stress is very, very high. And when we talk about there's almost a dichotomy in thinking that behaviour is an emergent property of the system, or people are the agencies within systems, and we do training programs and we train people. Now, I don't believe in the dichotomy. I think both are important. And I think if you want to shape systems, design systems, you need to have people that can operate with good situational awareness. They can't do that if they're overwhelmed or stressed. And it's a key feature of decision-making in complex systems. So that's one thing that you said that I really like. Then I'll probably disagree on the collapsing down into orientation. And I'll tell you, and even beginning with ACT. Sometimes I think it's appropriate to begin with ACT. My personal preference is to take a moment to observe orient, or at least orient myself. And I had this fantastic experience. I did surf apnea training. Just wanted to learn to breathe, right? Breathe better, 4-minute breath hold, that kind of thing. And part of the drill was that you get tumbled around lots and lots and lots. You end up at the bottom of the pool. You're all tumbled. And a lot of these agencies are so political that you need to kind of know who's who in the zoo before you start taking action. So I think that one is context dependent. And I got one other challenge, and that is I am particularly intrigued by implicit guidance and control. Now, the reason I pay attention to that is I view that as where we have developed an unconscious competence that can read the patterns faster than we can think about them and go straight into the action phase. So we're bypassing the conscious decision making. Now, for me, that's a goal of so much of our training. And I think that's my interpretation of some of what Boyd was hinting at there. So I love to simplify things, and I've considered crossing lines off or doing something different. But you know what? I haven't gone past his original, and I share that. It's a difference of context. Any comments or thoughts on what I've just said?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, all of this stuff is context specific. I think much of getting people past that local maxima of the simplified OODA loop is just breaking the pattern, like you said. So I say this as not as some sort of concrete, this is how OODA works. Obviously, all of these things are going on all of the time. And to your kind of point about, political systems and established systems, I hesitate to bring this up, but an example of action without orientation that is actually fairly effective, unfortunately, would be Donald Trump, right? I don't think anyone would expect that he is some kind of deep thinker or that he stops for even a second to orientate himself before he takes some action. But his in his case, fairly destructive, I think, OODA loop is such that he's rolling on to the next bizarre, crazy thing to say before the entrenched system has a time to kind of pick up. So it's almost like, he's an agent of blitzkrieg on existing structures and systems. And I think it's fair to say he 100% takes action now. Action first without probably anything else. And, the reason his OODA loop is so fast is because there is no substance there, arguably. But it's an interesting counterpoint. I would say that probably, 95% of most humans in the world don't want to go around just like blindly reacting to stuff. But, as a counterpoint, depending on what your aim is, I mean, the fact that he's still, remotely in the game that he's in is just absolutely bonkers to me. But there's something going on there, right? And it's, everything's OODA. OODA is everywhere. This is OODA, right? So somehow what he's doing conforms to OODA in some way, shape or form. I wouldn't want to emulate it, but it's useful as a thought experiment to look at, I think.
Well, we came into that part of the conversation with context is everything. You said context is everything, right? And this brings me to the Cynefin framework, which I know that you're also very familiar with. So in the Cynefin framework, 5 domains confused in the middle. Trump's usually gives the appearance of confused, but that's another topic. But then you've got the order domains on the right, the clear, the complicated, the complex, top left, and then chaos. Now, Dave Snowden talks about preferences for action. And I talk about preferred habitat because it sort of expands the ecology metaphor a little bit. Now, Donald Trump creates chaos because in chaos, of course, we act, sense, respond. It is the domain. The more chaos I can create, the more action is needed. We don't have time for analysis because I keep the pace and the tempo up. If I hold people in chaos, I can be a dictator and I can make decisions unilaterally. And no one's got time to catch up and sort my mess out. So, he's perfectly adapted to an environment of chaos. And the way to handle him is put constraints in place, laws, really hold him to account, slow things down, stop the chaos. And it's very, very hard because he's so very effective at it. I think there's an intersection between OODA and Cynefin, which are 2 sensational frameworks, I think, and then as you move the context around, you go, okay, given this context, how does OODA apply here? Well, look at the tempo, look at the chaos, and look at the disorientation that he introduces for everybody else.
Yeah. And if I may just build on that in an organizational context, Boyd talks about the cognitive spiral, right? The collapse that you are aiming to cause in your adversary if it's a combative situation. And in so many organizations, the leadership or the management of that organization is doing this completely by accident, right? And the way I explain this is that, Boyd spent his early career as a fighter pilot and an engineer. And so the OODA loop is kind of, I don't think it's really talked about that much by Boyd, but it's very much grounded in thermodynamics, right? So if you look at an OODA loop, the only place that you're exchanging information and energy with your environment is when you observe, when you take information in, and when you act, which is when you have some effect on the environment. Everything else is a closed system. I mean, I'm simplifying wildly here, obviously, because everything's going on all the time. But if you close off, what you're trying to do is using the OODA loop in an adversarial situation, you're trying to close off the ability to have this OODA loop working as a whole, right? So you're trying to either close off or confuse observation, or confound and obstruct action. And then what you end up with is this conceptual spiral is you're bouncing from orientation to decide to orientation to decide. You never actually manage to take any action or bring in new information. And, when you think about it, that's what happens in organizations so often is they don't have that feedback loop between the actions that they take, the expectations that they have and the outcomes. So they never make that kind of loop that's in essential to be able to improve orientation and improve your understanding of your domain. And the way management often pushes like new things without having this in place is exactly the same as what Boyd would have told, a fighter pilot to do in the 1960s to get inside your adversary's OODA loop. They're causing their own conceptual spiral in organizations. I've seen it so many times. I mean, it's one of the reasons I tried to start applying this in the first place.
I think that's an enormously important insight. And I think it gives some clues for the sorts of agencies that I work with, how they can redress that cognitive spiral that you talk about. One of the keys is having high quality feedback. If you're going to take an action, let's have some accountability for that. So building that into your accountability framework, you take action. I want the feedback loop back into orientation or observation. Let's move where it goes. And interestingly, I was reading today about just culture and that movement towards looking at accountability, shared accountability, where we respect the nature of the system and the individual in it together. We don't just go to individuals and blame them. We look at the product of the decisions they've made within the system, so it's contextual. It doesn't mean to say that we won't get rid of them if they're making terrible choices, but we do it within context of system. And that really interests me in what you've just said about the cognitive spiral. So I think that sort of relates there.
Ian, have you ever spoken to Tyson Yonkaporta?
No, not yet.
So he wrote a book. So he's a researcher based. He's Australian, and he wrote a book called Sand Talk. He's written a second book which I really ought to read, but I can't remember the name of it. And he's pulling on his perspective as a indigenous person who is living in a Western society. And Sand Talk is, I don't know if you've heard of the book or come across it.
I haven't heard of the book, but Dave Snowden has referenced it.
Yeah. So him and Dave have done a couple of dialogues. I had a chat with him about OODA a while back. But Sand Talk is, and the indigenous perspective in general is absolutely fascinating, because in many cultures like that, my understanding is that the orientation is not as it is in the West, right? Western is kind of individual first and then societal. And in some indigenous cultures, it's much more holistic. It's, as an example, I don't know how anecdotal this is, but there's a story to demonstrate this, which is, Kim's game, where you've got the, items laid out on a table, and then, you go in, you memorize it, you leave the room, somebody takes some stuff off, and then there's a blanket, and you come back in, and then they take the blanket off, and you have to say or you have to rearrange the items back to where they were. Yeah, they rearrange it, and they have to rearrange it. So your average Western person would come into the room, and then they would rearrange everything back on the table, oriented to the table. I'm probably vastly oversimplifying here, but in indigenous cultures, what they often find is that people come back in and they orientate things to the room. So if they come in and they change the table and all the stuff on the table, these people will then reorientate all the items in relation to the space around them rather than the individual kind of element. And I think so. I think that's an important distinction between, actions that an individual takes and outcomes that a system as a whole, that emerge from a system as a whole. And in that sense, like, accountability can be quite pernicious there, can't it? Because if you attribute accountability to an individual, well, it makes this whole kind of conceptual spiral perpetuate, because you never address the kind of systemic issues that cause it in the first place. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I really like this, this and individuals and system. It's not either or. And when we do that, we start to look at relationships, and we focus more on the relationship and what's reasonable within that context. I want to flip the theme for the moment. Just going back, so you've been in business now for longer than you've been in the military, right? What have you learned? What have you learned from business that you think could be applied back to the military to improve the way that they do what they do?
Oh, that's a great one. So, yeah. So this is a really good one. So I think in the military, we had what I would call very good social technology, right? We have, the orders process, debriefing, drilling, lots and lots of cultural artifacts that are incredibly effective at building good tactical, what's the word I'm looking for? Fluency, let's say, right? So at the tactical level, the Royal Marines are very good at building this kind of flow-based way of operating. At the higher levels, procurement, getting good kit, it was utter crap. Like the radios I was using at the turn of the century were 50 years old, 50 years out of date. So, I was cutting around in Saudi Arabia and Iraq with analog radios that weren't encrypted, that were literally 50 years old. And when I did my resettlement training, I resettled. I wasn't a programmer at the time. I started teaching myself to code while I was still in, but I wasn't really a professional level programmer. I did a resettlement course in 3G telecoms, and, reading books about how telecoms networks work. And I was like, how is it that, I used to risk my life with this utter shit kit, and actually this is what the state of the art is. This is what's available to civilians with a device in their pocket. So that's one thing that I think that Ukraine is showing us quite starkly: the ability to embrace and modify operations with technology that doesn't have to come through some convoluted 15-year-long procurement cycle. I mean, this can be done, in the Second World War, when you had like the SOE, they were inventing stuff weekly, right? But they were doing it themselves. They weren't going out to industry saying, hey, here's a requirements document for a limpet mine. It was like, no, I'm a, lunatic caravan engineer. I'm going to invent how to stick explosive to ships and blow them up because it's fun or something, right? So, and what's happening in Ukraine, obviously it's not fun, but it's innovation from the point of need. And you've got in Ukraine, you've got actually software engineers. And, I read a thing before of a guy who was an agile project manager or something like that, who was managing his unit's operations on Trello, right? But you laugh, but actually that's better than what we would probably have in the West, right? If you went into an ops room in the West now, you would probably have garbage old kit, tiny little screens, really poor technology surrounded by really good social technology. So if I had one thing that I would take, from my 20 years out of the military back to my 4 years in the military, it would be the ability to adopt and exploit new technology, because that is going to be the, if you have a military now that can't own its own destiny with drones and AI, you are so screwed next time the shooting war comes around.
Yeah, you've reminded me of a conversation I had very recently with Steve McCrone. I don't know if you know Steve. Does some great stuff on adaptive strategy. We collaborate in that space, and he was doing some work on risk, and he's got this really nice redefinition of risk. He said risk used to be defined by threat to objectives, ISO sort of statement, and he said, but in a contemporary world where there is extraordinarily fast-paced change in the adjacent possible, going back to Kaufman's work, he said, risk now is all about adaptive capacity. If you've got good adaptive capacity, you can handle risks as they emerge. If you're slow, you'll get taken out of the game one way or another. And I'm seeing that in frontline agencies. They're too slow, and the social pressures around them are engulfing them. It could be anything from workforce management through to managing expectations on a budget. There's not a frontline agency that's sustainable at the moment. Healthcare, where you are, it's true the world over. So I think there's a lot here. And I really like your answer. I really like the way you've reflected back that the strengths and what you could apply in reverse. And you were talking about signals and using 50-year-old radios and then getting into sort of 3G and look where we are now. I'm interested in weak signals, and that idea that you're a signaler and paying attention to the weak signal and thinking that is where I want to pay attention. And when we came in, the very first statement you had was about leaders are disoriented and there's so much information they can't work out what's important. And I spent with Mike a few years ago. I spent weeks trying to find a name for this podcast idea, which was a self-indulgent activity, right enough. I wanted to talk to people like you, but we couldn't find a name. And then one day I said, what about the Salience Podcast, where we just focus in on what do people need to know? Let's pull the nuggets out on all the topics we're curious about and do that summary. So that's kind of how we ended up, which is cutting through all that stuff. What's the salient point? And what are the weak signals we might be looking at? And that's my next question for you. If you think about weak signals, what is it you're tuned into at the moment? You think, that's a weak signal, or it's a signal that people aren't really paying attention to yet. It might be strong to you, but people might not have really noticed it yet. What would you say that? What's got your attention?
So my experience, I guess, my cultural background in technology was I ended up going down a very academic and rigorous programming language route into a domain called functional programming, and specifically a language that is a language called Haskell, which is used for a lot of programming language research. And, increasingly, it's got its own little niche in industry, but it's not super, super common. And the culture there is very much, you build your assurance into the program that you build. So you've got all these kind of type systems and compilers, and the experience of writing that is it's incredibly bloody frustrating to get something that actually compiles. But once it compiles, it works. And that's a mind-blowing experience as a programmer to get something that finally runs, and then it's like, holy shit, it does what I asked it to without any bugs. So that's the culture I was in 5 years ago. And now I've moved into low code. I've moved into automations and AI. And I've done it very deliberately because where the edges of an organization are where you need to move the quickest, right? You need to be able to free up people's time. You need to do it quickly. And you need to do it with the recognition that actually this is around the edge. It's not a core system, right? The world's not going to end if you screw something up. What you're really doing is fighting against humans, not fighting against, but you're comparing against humans who are already fucking it up in spreadsheets, pretty much, right? And then you overlay that with, the last 2 years of LLMs that have kind of, burst onto the scene and suddenly become something that everyone needs to pay attention to. And I guess my salient kind of point on this whole kind of ecosystem is that people are paying attention to the wrong thing when they're looking at AI. So I'm really glad you asked me this question, because I've been trying to articulate this for the last few weeks. So LLMs are obviously magical pieces of technology, right? So they're incredible that they kind of understand us and they can have a human-like conversation with us. And that's immediately made people gravitate to these things as a solution to everything. But actually, the way I visualize it is there's a whole, pyramid or an iceberg. AI is at the top. And then you've got a whole load of stuff that needs to be there to really, really make the most of it. Things like how your data is, and do you have an actual intuitive understanding of your business? Back to your point earlier about implicit guidance and control and Fingerspitzengefühl, right? Without that, AI is a tool that can leverage you in completely the wrong direction, or can build you in the right direction, can send you in the right direction. So I guess my takeaway would be that, all these companies that are looking at AI solutions that they can procure as products, they should be thinking about sorting their own shit out and then building these things on the top, because actually building AI solutions it's not difficult when you've got the right raw material, right? It's, a clever prompt, which you can learn in half an hour, how to write prompts. And it's access to the data. And if the data is in a good shape, the outcomes that you get from prompting AI is in a good shape. And you don't need to be spending a load of money on some other vendor who is doing what you could be doing. And, you don't need to be fragmenting your technology ecosystem more. You can be consolidating it if you treat the current crop of LLMs as they should be treated. So that was a complete diversion from, well, it's not really everything Zuda, I suppose, but you know what I mean? It's, I wasn't expecting to say that when I started saying it.
No, I think that makes total sense. I agree that I think if I go to your iceberg metaphor for a moment, I think people are kind of viewing things the other way around. They're coming in from the AI and saying, well, describe what, make the data and everything underneath me all make sense. And it's just making stuff up. It doesn't know how to deal with that. But if you give it all the structure and the architecture to say now synthesize this and make sense of what I've given you using the algorithms that you have, then that makes total sense.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that also speaks back to how the military, right back to our original kind of how we kick this conversation off. That speaks back to how the military uses structure to corral and manage chaos, right? So if you have this kind of constraint and structure, LLMs really, really love structure, right? If you give them open-ended questions, they'll blather on at length about absolute nonsense quite happily. If you give them very clear constraints of here's my inputs, these are the outputs that I want, and these are the constraints of how I want you to map from one to the other, they'll do a good job, and they'll give you a better outcome. And back to your the frontline agencies that you work with, if they're going to go and say, you know what, I want an AI product for X, a million vendors will be beating their door down to provide them an AI product for X. But actually, if they could treat this as an internal capability that they need to build in order to get better at, the thing that they do, they would have so much more mileage in spending the money that they would have spent on a vendor on internal improvement, building their own infrastructure. And that's basically the play that we have at Mission Control now is, if you don't have that capability, we don't build you products. We build you an understanding and a capability as we build you a product.
I think perhaps this is an example of the process that you're describing. Occasionally I get these phone calls, somebody will phone up and say, we've been asked by the minister to come up with a strategy for a period of time for the following thing. What do you have any time next Tuesday between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock? Right. I mean, this happened, right? And I laugh because you go, and of course I go, sure, I can do that. Like thinking, what on earth am I going to be able to do in 2 hours for a strategy, right? For this is $100 million spend. But I am in preparation. I jumped into ChatGPT and I said, in the following context, I'd like you to identify a North Star metric and 10 dispositional factors that we could monitor to achieve that North Star metric. And then I gave some more framing. I'd like this in less than 10 pages, written in the language of, and And I hit the button, and this thing popped out, and I went, you know what? That's actually pretty good. That is on the money. We had the meeting. We went around in circles. The humans all had lots of conversations and had pet things. But you know what? It was as good as where we got to in the conversation. Now we wiggled around, but that framing and just sort of being quite explicit, it gave some pretty tight stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one use case where LLMs are absolutely fantastic, right? They contain a probability distribution of all the ways that all the humans that they've parsed, of all of the text that they've parsed, would answer a question. And so, LLMs can be really good with either, you constrain exactly what you want and you give it the inputs, or you constrain exactly the process and you make the output open-ended. So it's kind of like, we're back to Boyd's destruction and creation, except it's creation and then destruction, right? You open up and then you throw away, or you throw away and then you open up. And it's this, that's the whole kind of, what does he call it? The dialectical engine, right? It's the whole process of improvement. And, and he wrote that in, 1976, which is absolutely astonishing, really, how far ahead of his time he was.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of people, when they're presented with something that's elegant and useful, really get this idea that they should improve on it. And they either oversimplify it or overcomplicate it. And sometimes elegant things, they just stand the test of time. And that's one of those ones I've not seen improved on yet, to my mind. And I think there's a few things I've taken. I'll do my Salience summary. There's a lot in our conversation today. I think where we began was thinking about the military and cross-domain. And you really quickly touched on a whole range of concepts that were influential and important for you. So you mentioned things like mission command, leading with intent, distributed decision-making, team of teams. These are all fundamentals, I think, of adaptive leadership and contemporary ways of leading. I think we're still there now. I think you then went on to the importance of paying attention on the edges, where it's fast moving, where there's overwhelm. Work with the human factors in there and the technology interface. And I really like that attention to let's pay attention over here and observation orientation on that part of the system. That's where our situational assessment needs to be. We need to play in that space. I really like that. And then the third thing I really enjoyed was this cognitive spiral, and the fact that inadvertently organizations are creating systems that are impossible for people to really activate OODA. And if we look at OODA, we say, actually, this is what you're doing, and this is where the weaknesses are. You need to go here and here. So there are three things I've immediately taken away, in addition to our broader conversation. And before we finish up, I'd like to ask one more question. You're in this domain. You're using OODA. You're helping these organisations. Where next for you? What are your future aspirations, either work or elsewhere in life?
Oh, you're asking me to make a plan.
Not necessarily. Actually, I'm asking for a direction, if I'm honest.
Yeah. So I think I'm pretty happy where I'm at the moment. Like, the interface of emergent technology and organizational improvement is kind of always where I've wanted to be. I've always kind of gravitated to more kind of internal technology, like, trading systems and risk systems, it's stuff to make the people in an organization more effective. So more of the same. I think there is a huge need for I don't know, inverted commas, non-technical companies to be able to leverage technology effectively. There are some incredible businesses out there that have built that social technology from the military. As I say, there are just some natural leaders out there that have built amazing businesses, really great at sales, got the ops really humming. And those are the ones that I think if you then overlay good technology, it's like the way the Ukrainians have basically, they embraced Mission Command from, probably a decade or so ago. And now they're really mainlining technology improvements in AI and drones and every possible advantage that they can eke out. So that's the model that, I see myself continuing to follow. I see myself continuing to build Mission Control as this kind of systems and operations partnership where I can partner with businesses that are on that kind of end of the spectrum and really help them make the most of emergent technology built on really solid foundations that are part of their system. I don't really see myself gaining into when you're going to build an AI product, Ben. And it's like, not saying never, but I just don't think it's the right way to utilize the current types of technology. It's what VCs would want you to do because it's high margin and, everyone loves a SaaS product because it's, great margins and you just pay for the development, but it's not really in service of what the market needs right now, I don't think. So I'm, aiming to be more like the kind of special operations executive technology development than BAE, let's say.
Yeah. Well, that certainly resonates for me. I would say that our niche is very similar, and it's the relationship between people and systems, not technologies per se, but systems more broadly. That can be policies, procedures, and it's that it's not an either or, it's an and us working on that relationship of how can we enable leaders to shape systems? How can we be aware of how systems might be shaping people's behaviour? And it's all entangled. How do we? And I'm borrowing from Dave Snowden again here. How can we actually entangle it more?
Yeah.
Rather than necessarily disentangle it. So I like that. I see that in a very similar guise. And I like that. And let's talk again and continue this conversation as everything evolves and continues moving along. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to. Awesome. Thanks, Ian.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.